Welcome to this explainer. We are plunging straight into the muddy, desperate spring of 1787, and I want you to step right into the boots of a delegate riding into Philadelphia. You've just fought a brutal revolution for this American experiment, but the reality? It's already failing. You're riding toward the Pennsylvania State House, but definitely not to celebrate a victory. You are there to stave off an absolute catastrophic collapse. You see, this wasn't some triumphant gathering of political geniuses with a flawless master plan. Not at all. It was an emergency room. It was the absolute crucible of the Constitution.
Imagine the existential dread gnawing at your stomach as you take your seat in that hall. The dust of the revolution hasn't even fully settled yet, but the nation is already crumbling around you. You and your fellow delegates are starting to whisper the unthinkable. Did we just win the war only to lose the country entirely? It's literally like standing in the middle of a burned-down village, looking at the ashes and wondering if it's even physically possible to build a new home. You're terrified, utterly terrified, that this grand experiment of self-government is about to die right in its infancy. That brings us to Section 1, the chaos of a dying nation, debt, rebellion, and ruin. Okay, let's dive into this, because the fear in that room was rooted in some very grim realities. The economy in freefall. The walls were rapidly closing in. You've got veterans who fought in freezing forests, returning home with completely worthless promissory notes, only to have distant courts seize their farms for unpaid taxes. And that sparked Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts. We're talking about armed, frustrated farmers shutting down the courts, and the federal government was entirely powerless to stop them. Meanwhile, British troops are blatantly violating the peace treaty by just hanging out in forts in the Northwest. Spain is blocking the Mississippi River, completely strangling American farmers. And internally, state governments are at each other's throats, taxing each other's goods, printing mountains of totally worthless currency, and driving rampant inflation. You're staring at all these external and internal threats, knowing that emergency action is quite literally the only option left. This geopolitical panic wasn't just felt by ordinary citizens. It reached all the way to Mount Vernon. George Washington, the man who held the entire army together through sheer force of will, was reading the news of Shays Rebellion, and he was devastated. He wrote, "I am mortified beyond expression. Everything appears to me to be going wrong." When the absolute hero of the revolution is feeling personal despair and a very real fear of total national collapse, you know for a fact his situation is at a breaking point. It was exactly this dread that pulled him out of his retirement and back into that room in Philadelphia.
Moving on to Section 2, the secret of Philadelphia. 55 men in a locked room. You're all gathered in that room primarily because of one thing, the Articles of Confederation. This was the deeply flawed first framework of the United States. Think of it as a skeleton government. It left Congress totally powerless to tax, to raise armies, or to actually enforce any laws. Plus, it required 9 out of 13 states to agree on anything, which, let's be honest, was nearly impossible. As a delegate, you know this existing system is completely useless against the looming anarchy. Sure, the officially stated goal was just to revise the Articles, but you and many others in that room know the undeniable truth. The whole thing needs to be scrapped. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer physical toll it took to scrap that government and build a new one. Secrecy was absolutely essential. The doors were locked tight, guards patrolled the corridors, and the windows were literally nailed shut to keep the press and the public out. Imagine 55 delegates spending 4 incredibly tense months trapped in the brutal, suffocating heat of a Philadelphia summer. The air was thick with the smell of pipe tobacco, candle smoke, and unwashed bodies. Tempers were incredibly short. You were exhausted, locked in fierce daily debate with men who have vastly different economic and regional loyalties. It pushed everyone in that room to the absolute edge of their sanity. Which leads us to Section 3, the fear of tyranny and anarchy. A clash of visions. Tempers flared so badly because you are all caught in an agonizing trap. On one hand, you desperately need a strong central power to save yourselves from economic ruin and foreign invasion. But on the other hand, you literally just fought a bloody war to escape a pain. This massive ideological clash created a brutal gridlock. You had James Madison's Virginia plan, a powerful 2-house legislature based on population. That was great if you were from a big state, but the small states panicked. They countered with the New Jersey plan, 1 house, equal votes for every state. And the room just erupted. The debate was so fierce, so fundamentally opposed, that the entire convention nearly collapsed right then and there. To survive this, you had to forge a delicate balancing act out of sheer necessity. The threats of walkouts were incredibly real.
Men were literally ready to pack their bags, go home, and just let the country burn. But they barely stepped back from the precipice with what we now call the Great Compromise. They basically split the difference. They created a House of Representatives based on population to appease the large states, and a Senate with equal votes to protect the small ones. Look, it wasn't a perfect philosophical victory for anyone. It was a desperate 11th-hour maneuver just to keep the fragile Union from shattering.
And that brings us to Section 4, the painful price of compromise, survival over morality.
So the crucial point is that this delicate balancing act had a much, much darker side. The decisions made in that room weren't just about political architecture. They were fundamentally about survival over morality. To keep the southern states from walking out and destroying the nation before it even really began, the delegates made some horrifying concessions. The southern states demanded that enslaved people be fully counted to increase their political power in the new Congress, while northern states fiercely opposed it. The sickening resolution they reached was the 3/5 compromise. It was this cold, brutal arithmetic where human lives were literally reduced to fractions, purely to appease slaveholding states and hold this fragile political coalition together.
And the worst part? The delegates knew exactly what they were doing. Gouverneur Morris, the man who actually wrote the final text of the Constitution, openly called slavery a nefarious institution. He was totally disgusted by it, yet even he reluctantly acquiesced. It's the stark, tragic irony of the moment. Here are men who had literally just risked their lives fighting for liberty, intentionally creating a political framework that protected human bondage, all just to ensure the survival of their new government. They even refused to use the word slave in the document, hiding behind careful, calculated euphemisms to maintain their uneasy pact. And this brilliantly illustrates how fear drove so many of their decisions. Take another major compromise, the Electoral College. As a delegate, you really don't trust the masses. You have this deep fear that direct democracy could lead to some charismatic tyrant seizing power through popular appeal. But at the same time, you also don't trust Congress to pick the president because you fear deep political cronyism and backroom corruption. So what do? You create an indirect buffer system. The Electoral College was designed as a careful, highly cautious safeguard to protect the presidency from the extremes of both mob rule and elite backroom deals. Let's move to our final segment, Section 5, A Fragile Promise, the aftermath of the Crucible.
By the time summer finally ended, the document they produced wasn't some flawless, divine blueprint handed down from on high. It was a patchwork. It was stitched together by absolute desperation, pragmatism, and deeply uncomfortable deals, intentionally left vague in a lot of places just to get enough men to agree. Finally, on September 17, 1787, the doors were unlocked. Only 39 of the 55 delegates actually dragged themselves forward to sign it. Men like George Mason and Edmund Randolph flat out refused, terrified by the lack of a Bill of Rights and the massive new power of discoverment. The men who did sign were physically exhausted. They were handing over a highly imperfect, deeply compromised survival pact. And frankly, as they walked out into the fresh Philadelphia air, they weren't even sure if it would actually hold the country together. Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds, because surviving that locked room in Philadelphia was literally only the beginning. The delegates now had to sell this fragile experiment to a deeply skeptical public, and that sparked bitter ratification battles across the states in 1788. It was a vicious, highly public war of words between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were so terrified of this new centralized power that they eventually forced one final massive compromise, the promise of a Bill of Rights, which was the only way to get the Constitution officially ratified. So, here we are. The Constitution was forged in an emergency room built on profound fear, intense regional divisions, and painful, sometimes agonizing compromises. As you look at the political discourse today, the ongoing battles over representation, federal power, and these deep ideological divides, you really have to ask yourself, did they win the war only to lose the country? Are the cracks that were so desperately sealed in that hot and smoke-filled room in Philadelphia still visible right now? Is this fragile experiment still fighting for its very survival today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll leave you to ponder that exact question.